December 10, 1943, Douglas Aircraft Plant, Santa Monica, California. Inside the cavernous assembly hall, the air was thick with aluminum dust and the whine of rivet guns. At Station 12, an engineer named Ed Heinemann leaned over a drafting table under the glare of a single overhead lamp. Before him lay a set of blueprints stamped "Rejected, Obsolete Configuration" in red ink. The design was for a twin-engine transport plane, boxy and inelegant, its fuselage more reminiscent of a flying freight car than a sleek combat aircraft. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Army Air Forces had turned it down 3 times. The specifications, they said, were too conservative, the speed too low, the range too short, the cargo bay too wide. It didn't fit the vision of modern air warfare, where speed and altitude defined survival. But Heinemann wasn't designing for dogfights or glamour. He was designing for necessity for the men on the ground who didn't care about performance charts, only that their supplies arrived, and their wounded got out alive. In a few short months, that rejected design refined by Douglas's engineering team under the reluctant sponsorship of the U. Army Air Transport Command would evolve into the C-47 Skytrain, the aircraft that moved the Allied war machine across continents, a plane that would prove not just useful, but indispensable. Yet in late 1943, the idea of a flying truck being the most reliable weapon in the American arsenal seemed absurd. Commanders were obsessed with bombers, glamorous, destructive symbols of air power. The transport plane was, at best, an afterthought. The military belief system of the early war years was rooted in a simple equation: victory through destruction. The United States Army, Air Forces, modelled on pre-war theories of strategic bombing, believed that wars could be won from the air by breaking an enemy's industrial heart. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, channeled billions of dollars and tens of thousands of engineers into perfecting high-altitude bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. In comparison, cargo planes were treated as logistical tools, not weapons. The existing Douglas DC-2 and Curtiss C-46 were considered stopgap measures, adequate for peacetime routes but unsuited for the rigors of war. By 1941, doctrine dictated that air transport would serve a purely secondary role, ferrying mail, medical supplies, and personnel between safe rear bases. That view began to unravel in the winter of 1941, when Japanese forces swept across the Pacific, cutting off traditional shipping lanes. The fall of Singapore and the Philippines demonstrated a terrifying truth: sea transport could no longer be relied upon. The Pacific was too vast, too contested, and too deadly for slow convoys. The Army needed aircraft that could deliver men and material over jungles, mountains, and oceans, aircraft that didn't need runways longer than a destroyer's deck. At the same time, across the Atlantic, another problem was emerging. Britain's survival depended on keeping its supply lines open to North Africa and the Middle East. Desert airstrips, hastily carved from sand and gravel, were tearing apart conventional aircraft. Maintenance crews struggled to keep transports flying in the dust-choked heat. Engines overheated, landing gear buckled. And still the cargo had to move spare parts, fuel drums, crates of rations, and wounded men on stretchers. In this environment, the humble transport aircraft long dismissed as a mechanical mule began to seem less like a luxury and more like the bloodstream of global war. The origin of the C-47 lay not in military theory, but in commercial pragmatism. In 1935, Douglas Aircraft had introduced the DC-3, a passenger airliner so advanced that it effectively created the modern airline industry. It was spacious, dependable, and able to fly cross-country with a single refueling stop. By 1938, it dominated American skies, flown by United, TWA, and American Airlines. But when war loomed, military planners scoffed at converting an airliner into a combat aircraft. The Air Corps preferred to develop purpose-built transports, arguing that civilian designs were too fragile for battlefield use. The first military adaptation of the DC-3, designated the C-39, was little more than an experimental prototype: stripped interiors, reinforced floors, and larger doors. Yet the plane's performance astonished those few who saw it in action. It could land on rough strips, operate with minimal maintenance, and take off fully loaded from runways shorter than 700 yards. Still, it lacked official support. The Curtiss C-46 Commando, larger and more powerful, was promoted as the future of air transport. On paper, it was faster and could carry more cargo. But as early field tests revealed, the C-46's complex twin-engine systems and pressurized fuselage made it prone to catastrophic failure in harsh conditions. Heinemann and his colleagues argued for simplicity. They believed that reliability, not speed, not altitude, was the real key to wartime logistics. As one Douglas engineer later recalled, "We were designing for the sergeant with a wrench, not the general with a slide rule." The defining crisis that would prove their point arrived over the Himalayas, the infamous hump. After Japan captured Burma in 1942, the only remaining supply route to China ran through the air, over the world's tallest mountains. The route stretched from Assam in India to Kunming in western China, 500 miles across the Himalayas, where violent downdrafts and sudden icing claimed aircraft daily. American and Chinese forces depended entirely on this aerial lifeline for fuel, ammunition, and food. The early transports assigned to this route were a disaster. The C-46 Commando, heralded as a technological marvel, proved fatally unreliable. Its engines failed at high altitude, its fuel lines froze, and electrical fires became routine. Pilots grimly nicknamed it the plumber's nightmare. In the first 6 months of operations, mechanical failures destroyed more C-46 seconds than Japanese fighters. Desperate commanders turned to whatever aircraft could survive the altitude, and that meant the older, slower C-47. To the surprise of nearly everyone, the C-47 thrived where its successors failed. Its air-cooled Pratt & Whitney engines tolerated extreme cold. Its thick wings provided lift even in thin mountain air. Pilots could repair it with basic tools and parts scavenged from wrecks. Maintenance crews discovered they could change an entire engine on a dirt airstrip in less than 2 hours. By the spring of 1943, the C-47 had become the backbone of the India-China Ferry Command. The plane's reliability transformed what had seemed an impossible logistical challenge into a functioning, if perilous, supply chain. The unglamorous aircraft, once rejected as obsolete, was now flying the most dangerous route on Earth, carrying octane fuel and ammunition through weather that shredded bombers. In a report to General Arnold that summer, Colonel William Tunner, commander of the Hump operation, wrote, "If ever a machine earned the right to be called a soldier, it's the C-47. It doesn't argue, it doesn't fail, it just flies." The Army's perception began to shift. By mid-1943, the C-47 had proven itself in 3 separate theatres: North Africa, Burma, and New Guinea, not as a transport of convenience, but as a combat enabler. It could drop paratroopers, tow gliders, and evacuate wounded under fire. Crews began modifying their aircraft on the spot, cutting larger doors for jeeps, reinforcing floors with plywood, adding heating ducts for high-altitude flights. The aircraft's simplicity invited creativity. Mechanics joked that the C-47 was a plane you could fix with a hammer and a prayer. When the Allies planned the invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, they required an aircraft that could carry entire paratroop units across the Mediterranean and drop them accurately in darkness. Against all expectation, the C-47 was chosen. On the night of July 9, 1943, waves of C-47 seconds lifted off from North Africa, carrying the paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division. Over the choppy waters, flak bursts illuminated the night. Crews could barely see the coastlines. Many aircraft were hit, others scattered off course. But the majority reached their drop zones, and the operation, despite chaos and heavy losses, marked the first time large-scale airborne assault had been attempted by American forces. After Sicily, the aircraft gained a new name among the men who flew it: Skytrain. For British and Commonwealth crews, it was affectionately called the Dakota, derived from its DC-3 ancestry. Whatever the name, its reputation was now unshakable. By the end of 1943, even the skeptics within the Air Force admitted what field units had long known: no other aircraft could do what the C-47 could. Production accelerated. Douglas's factories at Long Beach and Oklahoma City expanded to 24-hour shifts, turning out more than 150 aircraft a month. Women welders and riveters, Rosies as they were called, assembled fuselages in a blur of activity. Each completed plane rolled from the hangar bearing the stenciled words, "To Hell and Back," or Goonie Bird, the affectionate nickname bestowed by its crews. The irony was profound. The most reliable transport of the war was never designed for war at all. It was the product of civilian innovation, adapted reluctantly by a military establishment that had dismissed it as outdated. In the coming year, the C-47 would prove its worth in the most critical operation of the entire conflict, a moment when the fate of Europe would hang on the wings of those unassuming machines. June 5, 1944. Royal Air Force Station, Greenham Common, England. A pale dawn light crept across the wet grass as ground crews worked in silence. Row after row of olive-drab C-47 Skytrains stretched across the airfield like an army of sleeping giants. Each carried a chalk number on its fuselage, each preloaded with paratroopers from the U.S., 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Beneath the roar of idling engines came the quiet rhythm of men checking gear, parachute cords, toggle knives, silk maps folded into boots. The aircraft were already old friends. Soldiers trusted them the way sailors trust a ship. Crews called them Goonie Birds, a nickname born from the plane's ungainly grace, clumsy on the ground but majestic in the air. As one paratrooper later wrote, "They didn't look like warplanes, they looked like angels with engines." At 2200 hours, the first Skytrain rolled down the runway and lifted into the night. In its cabin, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole gripped a rope tied along the ceiling as turbulence rocked the fuselage. The plane vibrated like a living creature, the smell of fuel and canvas thick in the cold air. They were heading for Normandy Operation Overlord, the largest airborne assault in history. By the time the first gliders touched down in France, nearly 900 C-47 seconds had crossed the Channel. They dropped 13,000 paratroopers in the first wave, then returned to tow Waco and Horsa gliders loaded with jeeps, artillery, and engineers. Some aircraft flew 3 sorties within 24 hours. The cost was staggering. More than 40 C-47 seconds shot down, dozens crippled by flak. Yet the mission succeeded. Paratroopers scattered across Normandy's hedgerows were alive because their aircraft had done what no other could fly: low, slow, and steady under fire. Major John Howard of the British Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, whose men seized Pegasus Bridge that night, later wrote, "The Dakota came through hell and never faltered. Every man who lived to fight on June 6th owes something to that machine." In one remarkable case, a C-47 struck by flak near Sainte-Mère-Église lost hydraulic power and half its elevator, yet its crew managed to nurse it back across the Channel on one engine. Mechanics later found more than 100 bullet holes in the fuselage and declared the aircraft airworthy within 48 hours. Such stories spread quickly through Allied camps. Reliability, once considered mundane, had become heroism. The following year tested that reputation to its limits. September 1944, Operation Market Garden. The plan was audacious: drop 3 airborne divisions deep behind German lines in the Netherlands to capture bridges over the Rhine. It required near-perfect coordination and absolute dependability from the air transport fleet. For 3 days, over 2,000 C-47 seconds filled the Dutch skies. They carried not only paratroopers but entire gliders containing anti-tank guns, jeeps, and bulldozers. In total, Allied transport squadrons flew more than 10,000 sorties in 1 week. Despite severe flak and unpredictable weather, over 95% of aircraft returned to base. When questioned afterward about what allowed such endurance, Douglas test pilot Carl Cover offered a simple answer. "It's a truck that happens to fly." That humility concealed genius. The C-47's all-metal monocoque fuselage resisted torsion even after combat damage. Its Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines could operate for 1,200 flight hours without overhaul, double the expected lifespan. The landing gear's wide track prevented ground loops on improvised runways, and the crew layout pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and crew chief meant any two could land the plane if the others were incapacitated. Every feature reflected Heinemann's original principle, simplicity under stress. In the Pacific, Skytrains carved invisible highways through jungle and ocean. They delivered supplies to isolated marine outposts on Guadalcanal, carried wounded from New Guinea to rear hospitals, and parachuted guerrilla teams into the Philippines. When the Japanese surrendered in August 1945, C-47 seconds were already delivering food and medical supplies to prisoner-of-war camps within days. By war's end, Douglas factories had built more than 10,000 military variants, C-47 seconds, C-53 seconds, and R-4Ds for the Navy. They had flown in every theatre, under every climate, from -40 degrees over the Himalayas to the blistering deserts of North Africa. The aircraft's operational readiness rate exceeded 92%, a figure unmatched by any other large Allied airplane. For the men who served aboard, it inspired affection rather than awe. Staff Sergeant Tom Kelly of the 436th Troop Carrier Group remembered, "You didn't love a B-17. You respected it, but you loved a C-47 because it took care of you. It forgave your mistakes." Peace did not end its story. In the ruined cities of Europe, new crises demanded the same virtues: endurance, capacity, and trustworthiness. June 1948. Soviet troops sealed off every road and rail line into West Berlin, starving 2 million civilians in an attempt to force Allied withdrawal. The only route left was by air. Once again, the old Douglas transports were called from depots and storage yards, repainted, and sent back into service. Operation Vittles, the Berlin airlift, was a logistical miracle, conducted almost entirely with C-47 seconds and their larger sibling, the C-54. Pilots flew 24 hours a day through fog and ice, landing every 3 minutes at Tempelhof Airport. Each aircraft carried 3 tons of coal, food, or medicine. Over 11 months, they completed more than 250,000 sorties, delivering 2 million tons of supplies. When engineers inspected the surviving aircraft afterward, many were astonished. Despite near-continuous operation and minimal maintenance, most airframes remained structurally sound. Some had logged over 6,000 flight hours without major overhaul. The transport, once deemed obsolete, had outlasted empires. Its post-war legacy spread across continents. Converted into civilian DC-3 seconds, these planes launched dozens of national airlines from Qantas in Australia to Sabena in Belgium and Eastern Airlines in America. In remote regions of Africa and Latin America, C-47 seconds carried mail, medicine, and missionaries to places unreachable by road. During the Korean War, they served again, dropping flares for night attacks, evacuating wounded from mountain valleys, and towing gliders just as they had over Normandy. In Vietnam, 2 decades later, modified C-47 seconds reappeared as AC-47 spooky gunships, side-firing miniguns from windows where paratroopers once stood. From 1935 to well into the 21st century, thousands remained in operation. Many still fly today under civilian registration, 70 years after the first blueprint was stamped rejected. Looking back, the irony is almost poetic. The C-47 was never designed to win battles. It was designed to make battles possible, to carry the weight of men, machines, and mercy from one shore to another. Its strength lay not in armor or speed, but in humility, in the refusal to fail. Ed Heinemann rarely spoke of the transport in later interviews. He became famous instead for sleek jet fighters like the A-4 Skyhawk. Yet when asked in 1965 which of his creations he considered most important, He paused before answering, "The one that kept flying." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the final months of the war, a worn Skytrain bearing the serial number 42 to 100825 returned from Burma with its fuselage patched in more than 300 places. The crew had named it Old Fatso. Mechanics begged to retire it, but the commanding officer refused. "As long as she starts," he said, "she goes." On May 7, 1945, Old Fatso landed at Myitkyina airfield carrying 20 wounded men evacuated from an isolated patrol. The war in Europe had ended that morning. The engines coughed once, then fell silent. The logbook recorded its final flight: 1,442 missions, 3,800 hours, 0 forced landings. The engineer who first drafted its lines on paper had imagined only a practical transport. What he and his colleagues built instead was an artifact of endurance, a flying testament to the quiet genius of simplicity. In every war since, military designers have chased speed, stealth, and spectacle. Yet somewhere above a jungle, a desert, or a frozen mountain pass, an old C-47 still drones across the sky, carrying its load faithfully toward another rough strip. And in that steady engine note echoes the lesson of the Second World War's most reliable machine: greatness sometimes begins with rejection. March 1951. Daegu Airfield, South Korea. The wind that swept across the runway was sharp with snow and cordite. Rows of olive-drab transports stood ready, their engines idling in the pre-dawn dark. Some still bore the faded invasion stripes of D-Day. The same aircraft that had carried paratroopers over Normandy now carried the wounded of another war, a generation younger, a world away. For pilots of the newly formed United States Air Force, the C-47 was already a relic. Jet fighters streaked overhead at speeds that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Yet when the call came to evacuate the surrounded Marines from the Chosin Reservoir, it was not the jets that answered. It was the Goonie bird. Flying through blizzards that grounded most aircraft, C-47 seconds landed on frozen riverbeds, loaded the injured, and clawed back into the sky on wings heavy with ice. One pilot, Lieutenant Tom Rundle, recalled looking out the window and seeing fuel gauges reading near empty. "The engines coughed like old men," he said, "but they didn't quit." When the evacuation ended, over 4,000 wounded Marines had been flown to safety. Many owed their lives to the same machine their fathers had seen in France, a veteran in a jet age. By the mid-1950s, the world's air forces were moving on. The US introduced the C-119 flying boxcar and the sleek, turbine-powered C-130 Hercules. Yet even as these giants took over the front lines, the C-47 quietly persisted in the margins, flying mail to Arctic radar stations, dropping supplies to UN peacekeepers, serving as airborne command posts in the age of nuclear standoff. One of the strangest transformations came in 1956, when the Air Force began converting old Skytrains into electronic reconnaissance aircraft. Stripped of seats, packed with radar and listening gear, they prowled the edges of the Iron Curtain under new designations: EC-47, RC-47, SC-47. In the coded world of Cold War surveillance, the clumsy old transport became an invisible instrument of strategy. A pilot stationed in West Germany later wrote, "Our C-47 seconds were older than the men flying them, but they still climbed steady, held altitude, and came home every night. You could trust them in weather that scared the jets." When the Air Force finally retired its last C-47 from active US service in 1959, many aircraft were sold or given to allies. They appeared under dozens of flags: Turkish, Israeli, Indonesian, Brazilian, South African. Each new Air Force repainted the same silver fuselage and stenciled a new roundel on the wings, but beneath the paint, it was the same Douglas machine. Wherever they went, they lasted. Vietnam, the Goonie bird's last war. If Korea had proved the C-47's resilience, Vietnam would prove its adaptability. By the early 1960s, the US found itself fighting a new kind of war, one of jungle roads, hidden supply trails, and small outposts surrounded by enemy territory. Helicopters were fast but fragile. Larger transports needed runways that barely existed. The Air Force began recalling surplus C-47 seconds from storage, painting them dark grey, and sending them into Southeast Asia. They became everything at once: troop carriers, cargo haulers, ambulances, and even gunships. The gunship variant, AC-47 Spooky, carried three 7.62mm miniguns mounted to fire out the port side. A single Spooky could circle a village and unleash up to 6,000 rounds per minute, creating a continuous curtain of fire that soldiers on the ground called the Dragon's Breath. In the night sky over Vietnam, villagers learned to recognize its sound, a slow, rhythmic drone, followed by the distant rattle of gunfire and the faint red glow of tracer streams. It was ancient technology performing a modern miracle. Captain Ron Terry, who helped develop the AC-47, once said, "It wasn't sophisticated, but it worked." The C-47 had space, balance, and the strength to absorb recoil. We turned a transport into a fortress, and it never complained. Spookies saved entire outposts from being overrun, firing until their ammunition belts ran dry. When the Air Force upgraded to the faster AC-119 and AC-130, many crews refused to give up their old aircraft. "You trusted the Goonie," said one gunner. "She was like a mule that could fly." By the time the last AC-47 left Vietnam in 1972, it had flown more than 10,000 combat sorties. The humanitarian years. When the shooting stopped, another war began, the quiet one against hunger, disaster, and distance. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, retired C-47 seconds found new lives under the banners of the United Nations, Red Cross, and dozens of small charities. Painted white and blue, they carried food to drought-stricken villages in Africa, flew medicine into the Andes, and evacuated refugees from civil wars the world barely noticed. In Ethiopia, pilots of the World Food Programme nicknamed their C-47 Old Patchwork. Its fuselage was a mosaic of riveted panels scavenged from other wrecks. Yet it flew more than 2,000 missions between 1973 and 1981, feeding 500,000 people during the Great Famine. A relief pilot remembered, "The cockpit smelled of oil and sweat and old leather. The altimeter rattled like a clock about to stop. But every time you opened the throttles, she rose up like she'd never aged." In these humanitarian roles, the Skytrain returned to its oldest purpose, not destruction, but survival. Living legends. By the late 20th century, the C-47 had become a flying anachronism, a museum piece that refused to retire. A handful remained in commercial service, hauling cargo to remote jungles where no modern jet dared land. Others were lovingly restored by veterans groups and historical societies. In 1994, during the 50th anniversary of D-Day, 200 surviving C-47 seconds from 20 nations gathered in England for a memorial flight across the Channel. Among them was That's All, Brother, the very aircraft that had led the first paratrooper wave over Normandy. Restored to her wartime markings, she climbed into the grey morning sky once more, engines humming the same deep note that had carried her across in 1944. Observers on the ground watched her silhouette fade over the coast and felt, for a moment, the continuity of history, the same plane, the same sound, the same mission. A British veteran, then in his 80s, wept as he whispered, "I knew that sound in the dark, and I never thought I'd hear it again." A machine with a soul. Aircraft historians often describe the C-47's legacy in numbers: 10,000, 174 built, millions of flight hours, service in over 90 air forces. But numbers miss what veterans always emphasize: the personality of the machine. The C-47 was never graceful. Its takeoffs were lumbering, its climb shallow. On approach it wallowed like a whale, but it possessed a quality few aircraft ever achieved: trust. It forgave pilot error, absorbed punishment, and still brought its crew home. One airman said, "You didn't fly a Goonie bird, you worked with her." That relationship transcended generations. Modern cargo planes, guided by computers and fly-by-wire systems, may outperform it in every measurable way. Yet pilots who have flown both often speak with a kind of reverence for the old Douglas. "The C-47 talks to you," said an Argentinian pilot in 2004 who still flew one for Bush deliveries. "She creaks and groans, but she tells you what she needs. That's something no computer does." Perhaps that's why, more than 80 years after its first flight, dozens of C-47 seconds are still in active service, some as skydiving platforms, some as freighters, a few still ferrying supplies to the Arctic and Antarctic. They are, in a literal sense, timeless. In the Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center near Washington, D.C., one C-47 stands preserved beneath spotlights, its olive drab fading to brown with age. Visitors walk beneath its wings without realizing they are standing under one of the few machines that physically connected every major front of the Second World War. A small plaque nearby reads, "Douglas C-47 Skytrain. Transport aircraft, 1935, 2005. Still flying. Across the world, others rest in open airfields, their aluminum skin dulled by decades of Sunday. Some are missing propellers, others serve as makeshift cafes or schools. Yet each bears the same distinctive curve of wing root and tail, the unmistakable outline of a design that once failed to impress its superiors. Every rivet tells a story of flight and repair, of men who refused to abandon her, of a company that believed in practical engineering over perfection. In a quiet corner of the Douglas archives in Long Beach, historians discovered Heinemann's original 1934 drawing of the DC-3, the ancestor of the C-47. The paper is yellowed, edges frayed. Across the top, in fading blue pencil, is a notation in his handwriting, "Designed to carry what must be carried." That single sentence, more than any technical specification, defines the machine's philosophy. It carried men and supplies in war, hope and medicine in peace, and the memory of generations across time. It carried the idea that reliability itself can be a form of heroism, that the ability to endure, to keep flying when others fail, is its own quiet kind of greatness. As long as there are places unreachable by road, someone will likely still be listening to that low, steady rumble of twin radial engines and looking up to see the unmistakable shape of the C-47 passing overhead. The rejected design that built the world's most reliable transport plane never truly retired. It simply kept doing what it was designed to do: carry what must be carried, and keep flying. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.